Good evening. Good evening. My name is Ryan Short, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as a part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Pope Paul Shaw Center for Race and Ethnicity, the Women and Gender Resource Center, and the Departments of Anthropology, Film and Media Studies, Psychology, Sociology, Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the American Association of University Women at Dickinson, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, The New Culture Wars, Social Media Use and Racial Discourse. I've attended predominantly white institutions my whole life. As a result of this, I am used to being one of the few or only person of color in the room, making discussions about race particularly alienating. Teachers and other students would ask me questions as if I represented the entire Black community, or they would expect me to teach them how to be anti-racist. This can be very emotionally draining. Tonight, Dr. Apryl Williams will discuss this kind of emotional labor. This event and discussion is particularly important after the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 and the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. It can be emotionally triggering and difficult to talk about race, especially on social media or in virtual spaces. Videos and photos shared on social media documenting the unjust treatment of people of color have real and lasting impacts on people of color and youth whose newsfeeds are filled with violence and injustice against Black Americans. Williams will offer insight on how to engage in anti-racist discourse. Dr. Apryl Williams is an assistant professor of communication and digital studies at the University of Michigan and a faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She is also a senior fellow in Trustworthy IA at the Mozilla Foundation and an affiliated researcher at NYU Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. Williams' research has been featured in popular press outlets including Time, Wired, Mike.com, Newsweek, Slate, NPR's On the Media, and The Guardian. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the student and answer session. At this time, I please ask that you silence all cell phone and electronic devices. For students who are interested in participating in the Passport program, please scan the QR code on the back of your program to track your attendance through Engaged. For more information on the Passport program, please take a passport with you as you exit the auditorium after the event. In the event of an emergency, the handicap exits are located on the west side of the building. And now please welcome and joining Dr. Apryl Williams.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me. It's really nice to be here on your lovely campus, and I've gotten to know a lot of your students and faculty today, and it's been very delightful. So today I will be discussing civility and emotional labor that occurs in online spaces. And to do that, I will be using some popular memes that some of you may have heard of, such as the Barbecue Becky and Karen memes, to sort of guide us through our discussion and focus as a central point of our discussion. So let's start from the top. What is civility, and why is it so hard to have civil discussions online? Well, in the US, scholars who study social media, sociologists, communication scholars, would say that there are many versions of civility. Civility is tied to American democratic ideals and notions of what it means to be a good citizen, but these ideas, of course, do not exist in a vacuum. Our ideals about what it means to be American, about being a good citizen, were formulated by white slave-owning founding fathers. This kind of civility, associated with good manners and participation in public life, are also linked to the kinds of behaviors that white society considers acceptable. In short, civility is a white constructed concept and set of beliefs. This whiteness informed civility functions to create a good white central identity about what it means to be American, and erases alternative identities and alternative racial perspectives, and functions to assert control of spaces, especially public spaces, and the way that we talk about race in public spaces. Hence, civility can also be weaponized to meet white supremacist desires and to regulate non-white people in public spaces, including on social media. So the ruse of white civility can also be used to distance racial actors from their personal responsibility when they're engaging in heated discussions about race and racism. Perhaps that's why the Karen meme has been so hotly debated. On its surface, the Karen meme appears to be about white women who want to speak to the manager. They are eager to right the supposed wrongs of the world and return us all to a state of law and order. Karens are simultaneously uncivil in the way that they often yell to command attention, but claim to be exercising civility because they seek to patrol those who appear to disrupt the typical flow of law and order. So since Karens have become cultural shorthand for entitled white women who believe in a very particular version of law and order, let's take a step back and look at the cultural context of Karen as a meme. More often than not, white women who are called Karens are acting in an uncivil manner, yet they rely on racial tropes and racist stereotypes to patrol and regulate Black bodies in public spaces. But internet memes about Karens help us to explore incivility, racial hostility, and general social reaction to the Karen phenomena. So on the surface, memes appear happy and light, right? Cat memes, funny memes, popular memes. What could be better? But in analyzing the intertextuality of memes, I also analyze the actors and the actions that inspired the memes. And this is where things become less fun and lighthearted, because these actors, as you will see, are often malicious and operate to uphold white supremacy. So this presentation comes from research that I've done and has been published, and only represents a few cases that I treat as a case study on the larger Living While Black hashtag trend. Altogether, I've collected over 89,000 tweets about various racially biased incidences of white individuals calling the police on Black people for simply living their lives in a manner that does not conform to our common perceptions of law and order and civility. I have followed and collected data on 15 separate instances over the course of 4 years. Hence, I treat this study as an extension of a classic sort of ethnography, where tweets are serving as documented observations. And I couple these observations with a critical technocultural discourse analysis of the memes to yield my results. And that simply means I'm looking at both the technical and the social, and looking at how social media in particular fosters particular kinds of conversations. So first, I'm going to introduce the set of memes and the circumstances that preceded these memes, and also expand on some terminology that may not be universally understood. And next, I will map out the theoretical framing that I'm using to interpret memes and meme culture, and some of the theory that I use to interpret the actions of the actors that have been memeified. And I'll conclude with some broad implications and considerations for why it's so difficult to talk about race and civility in public spaces online. So on April 28th, 2018, Jennifer Schulte, a white woman dubbed Barbecue Becky, called the police on a Black family who was having a picnic at a park in historically Black Oakland. On June 23rd, 2018, Allison Edel, dubbed Permit Patty, also a white woman, called the police on an 8-year-old girl who was selling bottled water outside of their apartment building. Even though Jennifer Schulte and Allison Edel intended to use their power to patrol and regulate Black bodies, Black folks on Twitter used the moment to call out white supremacist beliefs and behaviors. A series of memes were created, beginning first with Barbecue Becky and then Permit Patty, which led to what we know now as Karen memes. But these two tweets and memes were sort of the early indicators, the predecessors for the Karen meme. And they really sort of shaped and sparked the genre. In the wake of numerous events in which the police are called on Black people for living while engaged in everyday activities such as grilling, selling water bottles on a hot day, lounging in a dorm, hanging out at Starbucks, selling cigarettes, and bringing home Skittles they bought from the store, a cultural conversation has emerged on the everyday policing of Black lives, Black bodies, and Blackness altogether. Using the hashtag #LivingWhileBlack, individuals have shared countless stories of how they are surveilled in their everyday lives. Black children are not allowed to be children, and Black men and women are not allowed to be free. In Schulte's case, she, a white woman, believed that 2 men were breaking the law when they were grilling with charcoal in a non-charcoal grill zone. As it turns out, there was some unclarity as to whether or not they were actually breaking the law, because grilling was permitted in the area. The uncertainty is about whether or not you can grill with charcoal. So in the video recording of the exchange, which I'm going to share in a second, Schulte tells the family that she's calling the police on them because she doesn't want our tax dollars to be wasted on treating more children who will get burned by hot coals. In Edel's case, she believed that the 8-year-old girl needed a permit to sell water bottles outside the city home, as if every child selling lemonade has a permit to do so. Importantly, both women called 911, which is to be used in emergency situations, not the local police station. This distinction is important because it highlights the fact that both women felt that these incidents were states of emergency: a Black family grilling and an 8-year-old girl selling bottles of water on a hot day. I argue that these memes, and the meme genre of Karens in general, subverts a white racial dominance and calls to account the privileged behavior of policing innocent Black bodies. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you a video of the multiple 911 calls, and yes, there were multiples, that were placed by Jennifer Schulte, urging the police to come and deal with a Black family who was having this picnic. In the video, you will hear Schulte frantically calling for help, and the clip is a bit longer than I'd like for it to be, but I think it's important for you all to hear as much of the audio as possible, so please bear with me as we're going through the clip. Before I do, however, I want to state that I include these memes both as a humorous sort of outlet, because that's the way that Black Twitter refers to them, but also because they center the Karen genre. So, internet memes can be described as an element of mass culture that pass from person to person via the internet. Believe it or not, there were memes before the internet. I know that's hard for those of us who have grown up on the internet to believe. But as cultural units, memes operate on cultural norms and are subject to the following stipulations. Memes follow a particular cultural logic, they are inherently participatory, and memes are culturally situated and dependent on a special context. Once memes make it into the dominant popular culture zeitgeist, they are often adopted by advertisers, celebrities, and other culture brokers, furthering their dominance in consumption. But the memes we will see today are a far cry from lolcats. And I conducted this research because I saw that these types of memes, which are in the Black activist meme genre, rely on more than just humor to communicate cultural flows. A critical piece of my argument is that these memes, Karen memes, Becky memes, and the like, represent a new genre of memes within the Black activist set. Black activist memes engender social change, whereas protest memes such as the popular sort of like Colin Kaepernick, take a knee meme, support social movement actors, and I'll return to that discussion in a little bit. So I wanted to introduce this idea of Black digital publics as the space where a lot of online discourse is happening. If you're on Twitter, then you're probably familiar with the concept of Black Twitter, which is a Black digital public. So these are spaces where people commune in the public sphere digitally. Black Twitter is one of a digital public, and there are very many where people are communing about lots of different ideas. But internet studies scholars like myself, Andre Brock, and Sarah Florini argue that Black Twitter uses a system of language, hashtags, and phrases that connote Blackness and insider status. And this discourse communicates who is in the in-group and who is in the out-group. So the Black Twitter as a concept is relatively difficult to pin down because there are so many people who use it, and not everyone who uses Black Twitter is Black. It's generally defined as an amorphous subset of users who conform to a cultural set of signifiers and identify themselves with the hashtag Black Twitter. So the most readily identifier marker is the language that users tweet with. You sort of have to know the lingo to participate in the dialogue and exchange of the culture. the same way that you do with all memes, right? You're not really going to understand the humor of lolcats if you have not been embedded in that part of American culture. So in this study, I do not attribute the circulation of these memes solely to what is commonly known as Black Twitter, as there are many others who circulated these tweets, and that contributes to the prominence of the Karen meme more broadly. So that being said, I wanted to highlight the fact that the term Becky in itself is a social signifier, and that the production of language is particular to this group, as is the emergence and reusing of Karen to act as a shorthand for white women. So the continued use of these signifiers helps to concretize the racialized meaning of a Becky or a Karen. And so now that we have our terminology all sorted, we can sort of move on to the video as promised.
Reports that someone is illegally using a charcoal grill in a non-designated area on in
Oops, that wasn't it. Okay.
Lake Merritt Park, kind of near Cleveland Cascade. I'd like it dealt with immediately so that coals don't burn more children and our city has to pay more taxes.
Okay, and where is this again?
It's on Lakeshore Avenue in Lake Merritt, near Cleveland Cascade, across the street from 2324 Lakeshore Avenue.
All right, and the person that's using the grill, I need a description of them. What race are they?
African Americans.
And how old approximately?
I'd say about 40
Okay.
or late 30s.
What color clothing is he wearing?
He is wearing dark black pants that are ripped and a black sweatshirt with an orange logo on it. I have a picture of it.
All right. And how tall is he approximately?
He's sitting down, so I'm not sure.
And is he thin, medium, or heavy build?
Heavier build. More muscular build.
All right. And do you want officers to come in contact with you when they get there?
Yes.
Okay, and what is your name?
Jennifer Schulte.
And what's a good phone number for you? Okay, we'll give you a call when we get there.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye. Hey, here's two Black Men Barbecue.
Oakland Police, hi.
Hi, I called about 2 hours ago about someone illegally grilling with a charcoal grill in Lake Merritt. Now people are being assertive and starting to push me and shove me. I was wondering when the police are going to come and help me.
What's the address there?
I am right across from Cleveland Cascade. I called 2 hours ago at about 11:02 this morning. And there has been no police that called me back, and now they're shoving me. And
What is the address there? Where you're from?
Lakeshore in Cleveland Cascade, also 2324 Lakeshore.
2323 Lakeshore?
2324 Lakeshore. It's in the park. Lake Merritt. I made a report at about 11:02 this morning. They said they would send a police
I don't
officer.
understand who's yelling in the background. I don't understand.
Oh my God! I know. I don't understand. That's why
Why is the person yelling?
I don't know.
Panic over a barbecue. I don't understand. Are you in the park yourself?
Yes, I am. I acted like this minute ago.
Okay, so why are you in an argument with these people? Can you walk away from them?
They're in my car. They keep following me. They keep following me because I'm following them. Not asking either.
What?
Nobody asking me. You're the one harassing people. You're the one harassing people. And the video is about my phone. Oh no, look at this. He's so scared. I'm not,
Can you
threatening me.
Okay, so can you get away from them? Are you living in the park or something?
No, I'm
Okay,
not.
I don't understand why you can't separate
They're
yourself.
following me. They're following
Okay.
me. That's okay. I've been waiting for police to come for 2 hours. For 2 hours.
Who is that you're with? Who is that woman in the back?
I don't know who that woman is. I don't know.
I hear somebody that's with you.
I know she's not with me. She's harassing me.
What's your name?
Please look up where the police were, the call that I made at 11:20 where I gave all my
I have it
information.
here. Just tell me your name.
I would like a police officer to come as soon as possible.
They're coming, okay, but look, you need to listen, okay?
I'm pretty scared. Call us.
You're in Lake Merritt.
Yes, I am.
How are they going to find you? What race are you and what are you wearing? It's a lot of people out there.
They have their cell phone number.
Just tell them they have your cell phone number. Just look for a lady at Lake Merritt Park today. You're going to have to tell me what race you are, how old you are, and what are you wearing. They will never find you.
Yes. I was told that when they are here, they're going to call my cell phone.
Why would they do that? They're coming.
I don't know. That's what the previous person told me.
You're talking to
that would happen
now. You're talking to someone right now. They're coming, but they're coming to Lake Merritt today.
Okay, so if you notice, the 911 responder repeatedly asked for Schulte's race, and she says later in the video that her race doesn't matter, and she's almost combative in her desire not to state her race. The responder is asking how she might locate Schulte in such a large public park. She describes first her clothes and her hair, and finally she says that she's Caucasian. When she was asked about the race of the accused, she did not hesitate to provide details about their race, size, the build of the man in question, and what he was wearing. During some further digging into police records of this incident, it was revealed that Schulte was evaluated for a 5150 psychiatric hold, but the police felt that she did not meet the criteria of immediately being a danger to herself or to others, though her behavior was indeed erratic and possibly indicative of psychosis, according to police records.
Of course, but
Oops, jumping ahead. Okay, so I use cultural scholar Michel Foucault here to frame the actions of actors as agents of white supremacist surveillance, particularly in this incident and in most other incidents that are used with the hashtag #LivingWhileBlack. White individuals purport to be everyday concerned citizens, right? They're acting in a civil manner. They want to do things that protect the community. They're being participatory in their democracy, right? That's sort of the purported behavior here. Calling in to make a concern about children being burned by hot coals, potentially. The underlying outcome, though, regardless of intent, is that white individuals exercise surveillance, extending the ever-present panoptic surveillance of black bodies by the state. They even call upon the state to exercise its disciplinary arm to arrest, patrol, and regulate black bodies in public spaces. And I have a quote from Foucault here that says, "Inspection functions ceaselessly. The gaze is alert everywhere. A considerable body of militia commanded by good officers and men of substance, guards at the gates, at the town hall, and in every quarter to ensure the prompt obedience of the people and the most absolute authority." And this is when Foucault is talking about the panopticon and surveillance. And briefly, the panopticon is the idea that it's based on a prison structure where the prisoners don't know when or if they're being watched. And so they essentially start to patrol and regulate their own bodies as though they're always being watched. And so scholars who use Foucault to talk about everyday surveillance of black bodies in public spaces make the connection that if black people don't know when they're being watched, they sort of have to always be on guard. And of course, we know that when you're always on guard like that, that can have negative health effects and negative health outcomes. So I pair Foucault with epistemologies of ignorance with another theorist, and subsequently many feminist scholars and critical race theorists, who frame ignorance as an active social process that reproduces aspects of power. So the dominant racial contract prescribes, as a condition for membership, an epistemology of ignorance. And Mills goes on to say that the system is such that white people will act in racist ways while thinking of themselves as acting morally. So here we see this woman, Jennifer Schulte, making a phone call to the police, thinking as though she's acting in a morally just and civil way, but in actuality, she's acting in a racist way. Hence, she enacts this ignorance, this feigned ignorance, performative ignorance, as a way to assert racial dominance. And here the ignorance is about her own racism, right? She's pretending that race doesn't matter, and that this is only about the children who will be burned by hot coals. And she intentionally and repeatedly asserts that her race does not matter while highlighting the race of the man who was grilling in the park. So simultaneously, her race doesn't matter, but his race does matter. So racial formation sort of helps us understand where this feigned ignorance about racism may come from. This is a theory developed by two sociologists, Michael Omi and Howard Winant, in which they describe the racialization process as one that is socially constructed in which meaning is always changing. Meaning is attributed to race, and that comes from what we as a society make it out to be via economic, political, and social forces. So racial categories are socially constructed, they're always changing, they're non-stable, and they're determined by social and the political, and this process is continuous over time. So racial projects then connect what race means in a particular discursive practice and the ways in which both social structures and everyday experiences are racially organized based on that meaning. Hence, I argue that the act of calling the police for living while black and resulting set of memes represents a racial project wherein the actual events that occurred are part of the prevailing racial project and racial narrative in the US, that black bodies need to be policed and surveilled at all times. The repeated use of police force to regulate blackness is a result of this feigned or real ignorance that positions white people in positions of power over black bodies in public spaces. And so by the same token, though, memes help to subvert this labeling, help to underpin or upend this labeling that happens where white actors are committers of crime, as though they are saying that they are acting civilly, but Black Twitter and the memes that are created in response to this, so things like Karen memes, actually point out that white actors are committing crimes. So Karen memes ultimately produce and represent a counter-surveillance that patrols whiteness, as well as a counter-narrative that directly challenges an established racial project. So people, particularly white people, who get offended about Karen memes are often offended because they feel indicted. Their performative racial ignorance is unveiled as a performance, and the performative civility is revealed as a farce. Black digital publics recognized this cultural moment as a time for change and began to create memes that directly spoke to moments of racial terror and violence at the hands of Karens. So I use this critical technocultural discourse analysis in conjunction with several other methods. As a sociologist, I use ethnography, and I look at this through several themes. And I'm going to go over the three themes with you all before we transition to a more broad discussion. So the analysis, just to reiterate, is that white people are operating on a cultural logic which makes it okay to police and surveil black bodies. This is based on a shared history of policing black people and black bodies, which relies on this sort of feigned ignorance about racism and racism during the act of being a Karen in a public space. So the first theme centers on everyday policing of blackness. And this theme suggests that policing of blackness is routine, commonplace, and mundane, highlighting the fact that it is an everyday expectation of whiteness and an enduring struggle of blackness. Black people use humor and popular culture references, back to the concept I mentioned earlier, signifying, to drive home the idea that these occurrences happen every day in a casual manner. Moreover, they call attention to an underlying issue that disgruntled white individuals are upset specifically because black people are free and happy, as demonstrated by the piece of the pie meme. So for those of you who have never seen The Jeffersons, the whole show is based on this idea that they're moving on up, they're climbing the social ladder, and they have some neighbors. There's a crossover show, now I'm getting into media history, but they have some neighbors that are quite racist, right? In a quote unquote funny way. And so often they are dealing with the struggles of being wealthy black people in a primarily white building and in a primarily white area of town, right? And so we can see Barbecue Becky here is positioned in the corner. She's calling the police on them. And she's like, they've got a piece of the pie, meaning they're enjoying their lives. Wow, what horror. I can't believe this. This is unjust, right? And then here to the left, we have her, my left, black people minding their own business, right? So she's calling and reporting. And this is the black gentleman in the back there is actually the man that she was calling on. So you can see he's not harassing her, he's minding his own business. And in fact, she is crashing their family picnic in a historically black neighborhood at a historically black park in historically black Oakland. So really, there's no reason for her to feel threatened there. In actuality, she's coming into their space and is acting as a threatening, harassing presence. Yeah, this one's pretty great, right? So this meme and several like it highlight the power of white surveillance and the dominant cultural logic that positions white people as the pinnacle of privilege in the US. They have so much power that they can even police the only black president we've ever had. So she's calling on President Obama because he's got too much power. Theme 2 draws connections from the current policing of blackness and takes a somewhat humorous stance to connect Barbecue Becky and Karen's with historical policing and surveillance of black bodies. It further highlights the historical accuracy of white surveillance on prominent black figures, including MLK, for decades, again hinting at the idea of white supremacy. The coloring of Barbecue Becky here in black and white explicitly positions her as a stand-in for historical white surveillance. Here, Barbecue Becky and Karen's represent the ever-present watchful eye of white supremacy, suggesting that this surveillance is the same yesterday and today. The historical context really drives home the idea of Jim Crow segregation and policing, collapsing context, suggesting that they are one and the same, both yesterday and today. Continuing, she's positioned as the ever-present, hyper-vigilant white actor. The meme puts her and Karen's in direct conversations with the free speech argument and suggests that white people have the power to police when and how free speech is expressed and invoked. Theme 3 deals with the current discussion on white tears and white fragility, specifically white women's tears and how they use them to strategically combat racial discomfort. That is discomfort when faced with discussions about race, but also when confronting their own white guilt. Hence, these memes position Barbecue Becky and Karen's as fearful of blackness in itself. But also in a series of crying images, she is positioned as strategically using her tears in the face of blackness. So here I return to the epistemologies of ignorance theory, in which these women, Karen's, Becky's, whoever, see their actions as innocent and even righteous when calling them the police, but she relies on this performative white ignorance and purports to be colorblind. Sociologists would say that her actions stem from a feigned ignorance that must be performed in order to garner acceptance from a majority white society. Playing on the idea of white women's tears as a weapon, she starts crying right at the end of the video, only when she sees the police. So there are several videos of this incident, one from her perspective, and one from the 911 perspective, and one from the perspective of the people who were being harassed, who you could hear a little bit from in that 911 call. So if you have time, I encourage you to watch all of the videos in which she maintains her composure throughout the entirety of all of the videos until she sees the police. It is only then, almost like clockwork, that she begins to cry and runs to the officer. So I'm not here to say whether or not folks should put raisins in potato salad, but I can tell you that Black Twitter certainly does not believe that you should do that. Hence, this meme is making a joke about the fact that white women are triggered by even the tiniest of offenses, such as someone not caring for a particular recipe. Coupled with the imagery of the police car in the back, the meme as a whole suggests that white women use their tears to invoke law enforcement's power. So as you can see, there have been many of these moments, and as a result, many states, including California, where this incident happened, in Oakland, and also in Michigan, where I am currently residing, either already have or are moving to make it illegal to use 911 to call the police on Black people for non-criminal offenses. And here, there's a guy in the background who goes by Coupon Carl, or who was known by Coupon Carl. So it's not always women. But these are many incidents that have been memed where people are calling in the police over minor offenses, like someone trying to use an expired coupon, which who has not accidentally or intentionally tried to use an expired coupon at Bed Bath & Beyond, because they always take them and they don't care. So that is not an offense that someone should get the police called on them for. The language in these legislative policies states it is illegal to call the police based on racial bias or for calling the police on Black people for simply living their lives. Further, the park where the incident happened is now a host of an annual block party in which Black people gather to reclaim the gentrifying park space, which is located in historically Black Oakland. I see this as a major victory for Black Twitter, and I position this Karen meme genre and the Living While Black hashtag as a type of counter-narrative and counter-surveillance against prevailing racial projects that paint Black bodies as a threat and as though they are in constant need of policing. So these memes have ushered in many Karen acts across the country, which stands for Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergencies. And we're seeing this legislation pop up in New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Oregon, California, and other places since then, since this work was published. But the key here is that the actual civility is rooted in not being abusive of your policing systems and wasting their resources because you're having a racist moment, right? You're being confronted by possibly white guilt or this feeling of racial discomfort of having to talk about race and using the police to justify the actions that you're doing. So the reality is that people of color, and in particular, Black people, live in a state of fear of the police most times. And I'm not sure whether the white people who are calling the police for these negligible offenses are aware that they hold that power, but in any case, the outcome is clear. White people are able to use their power and privilege to call the police on Black bodies, maintaining the dominant racial project. And who knows if upon arrival, an officer may end the life of a child, a family, or a person. That's why these everyday acts of casual bias are dangerous. And this is also why Black people feel these conversations about race so deeply, because for them, for us, it's personal. It's not an abstraction about a case that may or may not happen. For us, we've seen these cases play out all too often, and that's where the emotional labor piece comes in. So emotional labor is theorized by Arlie Hochschild and is really about having to manage your facial expressions, your body, your emotions in a way that makes the dominant person in the room comfortable. So often we use this to talk about relationships and marriage where women have to engage in emotional labor to ensure the comfort of their children and their spouses. When we're talking about this in a racial perspective, we're talking about Black, Latino, and Asian folks who have to maintain their compulsion or composure and maintain a calmness about them when they're talking about race and racism so as not to offend the white people that they're often having these conversations with. And especially now, where we have people who are so willing to call the police on folks for engaging in conversations where they feel threatened by race, it's more important for people of color to engage in this performative quietness or meekness, because you don't ever want to set off the threat, set off the alarm that you might be a threat, or to seem threatening to non-Black or non-POC folks. So this emotional labor engagement is exhausting, right? Which is why we see so many people on social media saying, I'm just not going to deal with this anymore. I'm just not going to talk about race anymore, because it's exhausting, especially if you are someone who is a person of color for which these things happen on a routine basis and impact your community. So how do we move past that feeling, right? The reason why it's so difficult to have civil conversations about race online is because people are getting to the root of the cause on both sides. People of color recognize Fain's attempts at colorblind ideologies and feel the ramifications deeply in our souls. Their physical bodies are policed in public spaces, online and offline, and then their tone is especially policed online. Alternatively, those who don't want to hear about race probably don't want to acknowledge the role that race and racism plays in our everyday lives. But if race did not matter as much as people would like to think that it doesn't, why are lawmakers trying so hard to legislate its mention in school? Instead of being triggered by talks of racism, I urge us all to proceed in the way of anti-racism. Anti-racism means acknowledging that racism exists and has always existed in the US and has always been a problem in the US. It means taking ownership of our actions, the things that we're saying, the things that we don't know that we believe about other races, and acknowledging that we're all starting from different places, but taking ownership when we're messing up. It means being willing to listen, especially when you know that you don't know about someone else's lived experience, and resisting the urge to invalidate them. And so I'd like to conclude there with a call to engaging in anti-racism. And if you haven't read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, I suggest that you do. It's a great book. Thank you very much.
We will now begin the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Because this program is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you before asking any questions. We do reserve the first questions for students, and after that point, we will open it up to the rest of the audience. So we will now take the first question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to our school and presenting. I don't know if I caught it right. You said you gathered around like 80,000 memes. Yeah, like how did you go about collecting all that research and storing it, organizing it? I'm a senior. I'm in the process of starting to write my thesis. So like research for me is very intimidating. So I guess I wanted to know if you had any advice on compiling, organizing, storing your research.
Yeah, absolutely. I skipped that part because I didn't want us to run out of time, but I'm happy to talk about it now. So I actually had a colleague scrape all of the data from Twitter. So he set up a program that would just check for the mentions every day, would check for the hashtags every day, and then would store them to a secure server. And then I opted to not collect any identifying data about people for privacy and ethical reasons. I don't think most people, when they tweet, even if it's public, are not intending for us to study them as subjects. So I think it's really important to be mindful of how we are collecting data and being careful to protect people. And even now, I don't have sort of like a strong stance on what the best practices are for doing this kind of research. And I would say if you're not someone who is tech savvy and you're not gonna write a program to do this, you could do it the old-fashioned way, which is you check every day and you keep a log of the information yourself. It's essentially the same thing, just because I had a full-time job at the time, I automated the process rather than checking in. But I did check in pretty regularly as well, just so I could make sure I was understanding the context, because if you're just abstracting the data, then you're not really doing an ethnography and you don't really know the depth of the social context. You have to be able to see the conversation in action. Yeah.
We can open it up to non-student questions and student questions.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how have your your personal experience affected your research or influenced your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So my father is 85, and he was born in 1937 in Texas, in segregated Texas, in a small town outside of Austin. And so my whole life I grew up hearing about what it was like to grow up under segregation. And for me, it's always really inspiring to hear about what that generation was able to do, to be able to shake an entire social system that was so deeply entrenched, ingrained in American society. I think that's really powerful. And so really hearing all of that stuff growing up, and hearing about how my dad worked tirelessly to usher in the end of segregation and also just for equitable rights for everyone. When I see movements like this, I recognize that it's the same kind of energy, that people are calling upon the same kind of energy and they're calling out the same kind of injustice. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, we hear about this term internet activism or Twitter activism, but clearly in this case, the Twitter activism has led to maybe more traditional activism, lobbying, getting laws. How has that played out, or how do you see that playing out? Like, what process does that take?
Yeah, absolutely. I think originally sort of internet scholars were thinking about sort of like internet activism as a standalone thing. And I think if you are engaging in activism that is only on the internet, then you're not really an activist, right? Like if it's just online, then I don't know that you could call yourself an activist, but that doesn't mean that you're not participating in the movement. It's sort of like if there's enough people to generate awareness, then that in itself is doing something to generate social change. But I think in this case in particular, it was at a really good social moment where these incidents happened in 2018, where there was sort of a lull in Black Lives Matter activity. And then in 2020, we had this resurgence where the same kind of ideas were being picked up, but instead of being called all the other nicknames, it was now just being centered on Karens. We had Central Park Karen, who used very explicit racial language to say, I'm gonna call the police and tell them that a Black man is harassing me in the park. And we actually know that that's not at all what happened, right? Like, he's just trying to watch some birds in the park. He's just trying to live his best life in nature. And she's actually the one who's harassing him. But these conversations led to, and I think add fuel to the larger movement, and also help people to see how maybe things that they're not doing intentionally also detract from, right? Or can be racist in a way. I think the Karen meme allows people to question their own behavior in a non-threatening way, in a way that maybe other conversations about race and racism don't do. And so that in itself to me is powerful, and helps to sort of usher in the movement for equity for Black lives. Thank you. Oh, there's a question up in the front.
Hi.
Hi.
So in addition to the Karen memes, were there any other memes that you saw underneath the Living While Black hashtag that also perpetuated this policing on Black people?
Yeah, actually, so the paper that I wrote is called hashtag Black Memes Matter, Living While Black with Becky and Karen. And I actually covered 15 different incidents where people are calling the police on people for like being at a pool, being in a public pool, which is the same thing that they were doing in the 50s, right? So things haven't changed that much. So yeah, there are lots of different incidents that people, right, like the Starbucks thing where the two Black men in Philly had the police called on them for quote unquote loitering, right? Lots and lots of them, unfortunately.
Have you thought of or have an interest in longitudinal measurement of this to monitor societal changes through possible political changes and or cultural changes or climate or anything else like that that might be of interest to the subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't necessarily have any interest in it because I sort of was like, this is the project that I set out to do, and then I moved on to a bunch of other stuff that I was really excited about. But I do keep getting pulled back into it because we keep having cultural conversations about Karen and what it means to be a Karen. So in that way, I'm sort of still tuned in to what's going on. And I do think that there's an interesting shift. Like if we were to look at a timeline, sort of like, it just so happened that the pandemic and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 happened at the same time. And so we were seeing people talking about Karen as someone who wants to talk to the manager of the pandemic because certain people just like didn't want to stay home and didn't feel like their bodies should be policed. And that's fair, right? But at the same time, then we had Karens who were policing people's bodies just because they were a different race than them. So the irony there is that we had Karens talking about bodily autonomy while limiting bodily autonomy for other people at the same time, which I think is like a chef's kiss of irony. But then there was sort of a backlash, right, where people said, like, isn't it racist to use Karen as a shorthand? And to that, I would say no, right? People have been calling Black people Shaniqua and Kiki for, like, I don't know how long. And it's not that we're saying, or that the people who are using the term Karen, right, to describe white women are necessarily saying, like, all Karens are bad. They're saying that Karen is a shorthand for a set of behaviors that are reprehensible, right? And so I think that there have been different iterations of the conversation that people are having, and it'll be interesting to see how it ages. Every time I think we're done with it, I sort of am like, okay, yeah, that interview that I did was the last one I'll do on Karens. 3 months later, someone else is like, hey, can you come do this interview on Karens? And I'm like, I can't believe we're still talking about this. But I think people really are into this idea and what it represents for our society right now.
Hi. So you were talking about the memes regarding racism, and you mentioned that they may be outlets for many Black people. But based on your research or your own personal opinion, do you think that these memes diminish the severity of these issues for those not within the Black community?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question that I get asked all the time. I think it depends on who you're asking, right? So for people of color, people in the Black community in particular, who are used to experiencing these things, I think that they're using humor as catharsis. It's a way to sort of cope, right? Because it's sort of like, okay, how many times are we gonna watch someone die and like go through this communal depression, this like communal mourning period? And so it feels safe to laugh at the Karen memes because they're all almost moments. They're all moments where no one was actually killed, whereas you don't have that same thing when there's actually been a death in the communities, right? So this feels like a safe way to sort of like a sigh of relief, right? Like, oh, thank God, nothing happened, and this is just another entitled person acting out of their rage or whatever the thing is, right? I do think that if we aren't careful, it could lead into sort of like just overly humorous. But my tendency is to think, for the most part, people are sort of understanding the significance of this, or at least there's a conversation starting where we're starting to get into the significance of this and why it's important.
So, sorry. I was kind of wondering about, like, if these Karen memes had any influence on data trends of, like, basically inappropriate police calls that are, like, a waste of taxes and everything. Because I know while all this being on Black Twitter definitely raises awareness to, like, other communities, I don't think there would be many, like, Karens or, like, the audience that needs to see this on Black Twitter.
Right. Yeah, so the great thing is that these Karen moments have been picked up more broadly than the predecessors like Barbecue Becky and Permit Patty and Coupon Carl, right? Like, most of the Karen memes that we know to be Karen moments have been picked up by CNN, by Washington Post, by NPR, like the Central Park Karen, as she's called, which is Amy Cooper, or the, what is it, in Missouri, the St. Louis Ken and Karen, as they're called. I don't know their actual names, right? Where they showed up in their front yard with a gun as protesters were marching by. So it's things like that where I do actually think that major news outlets are picking these things up and sort of helping to usher in that wider cultural conversation. But in terms of trends, no, I don't have any tracking data on like how this has played out over time in the media.
Hi. Cancel culture is something that I've heard a lot about. It's really interesting for me. I was just wondering if that's something you came across in your research and how it maybe played a part in it.
I try to stay away from cancel culture, to be honest, because I have really conflicting feelings about it. I don't know that canceling people is the right way to sanction people in our society. It doesn't actually encourage rehabilitation. It doesn't encourage people to learn from their mistakes and to be able to have introspection around their actions. But at the same time, I don't know what the alternative is, right? I also don't want to consume music from R. Kelly if he's going to keep doing the things that he's doing, right? So it's sort of I don't know what the solution is. So yeah, cancel culture is not my jam. I think that we need to rethink the way that we cancel people, quote unquote. I do come across it, and that people are always asking me when I talk about this research to talk about cancel culture, which is interesting to me to think that they are related in some way for people. But for me, I typically stay away from studying cancel culture directly.
Sort of as a follow-up to that, I mean, obviously the subjects of these memes are not necessarily the intended audience for them, but has there been any follow-up with any of the subjects that's revealed that they have maybe grown or learned something from seeing themselves through this mirror?
Yeah, that would be interesting. I don't know. I know that Jennifer Schulte, who's Barbecue Becky, was disaffiliated from Stanford. Her university profile was removed. And I know that Permit Patty, the one who called about the water bottles, I believe she was trying to get a permit to be a weed dealer, not a weed dealer, a legal marijuana establishment. So I think that's what she was doing, and I believe she lost her bid to get the permit because of this. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that in addition to the Karen acts that we're seeing pop up in different places, there's also social stigma associated with it. And there have been a few articles that are where Karens say, now I can't get a job because people don't want to hire me, or it's really hard to get a job. And I think that is exactly the intent for some people when they share these, is that they want to provide some form of social sanctioning, where people say, especially Black people are saying, there are consequences for your actions. You don't get to just disrupt people's lives and call the police on them, which could majorly disrupt their lives if they are arrested or are found to have a felony, right? Things like that. You lose your voting rights. There's so many social consequences because of these things. And so I think part of that counter surveillance that I was talking about is the sanctioning, right? It's saying yeah, we want you to lose your job, and that's why we're going to post your face everywhere so that it's harder for you to get a job. And maybe other people won't be tempted to do the same kinds of things.
Hi, my name is Ella, and I just had a question. With the Karen meme, there's a lot of historical connection. There's the stereotype of Black men being very predatory or trying to take the white men's women. Mm-hmm. And that that historical stereotype. Did you in your research make that connection where you had the theme about connections with historical moments, did you consider that and how there's that special or unique type of situation in society that might be different from just Karens attacking Black people in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the paper, I explicitly make those connections. You just got to cut some stuff out when you're doing this for a broad audience because you don't have enough time to cover all the minutia. But certainly that's part of that racial project, right? Like the myth is that Black men are scary and are monstrous and have this ravenous sexual appetite. So when Karen, Central Park Karen, calls and says, I'm going to call the police and tell them that a Black man is harassing me, she's directly making connections to a long legacy of white women who call the police and say that a Black man has raped me or a Black man has done X, Y, and Z, right? Like, that's exactly what led to the murder of Emmett Till. And so that connection is very overt for people of color, for Black people in particular, and maybe less overt for casual white observers, but that's exactly what I'm talking about, where white people are relying on that history, that racial and racist history, to call in that policing arm of the state, which we know can result in murder of Black people.
We now have time for one final question.
Hi. So you mentioned that a lot of your research is focused on like Twitter specifically, and I was curious as to why you picked that like social media platform specifically, and if you did look more briefly even at other social media platforms, whether there was a difference in kind of the content there.
Yeah, so each platform has its own personality and its own demographic, and that changes over time as well. So in 2018, a lot of people were using Twitter. I think it's changed a little bit. A lot of people are still using Twitter, but maybe for different purposes. Twitter serves as more of a news function, right? Like a lot of people get their news from Twitter, which is interesting and a little bit scary if they aren't willing to flag misinformation more carefully. Whereas Instagram is more like entertainment based and you're sharing information about your life. And of course there's crossover, right? And I saw a lot of crossover on Tumblr too, which I thought Tumblr was dead and now Tumblr's back. So it's sort of like you never know, but there are always different communities processing and playing with ideas in different ways. I use Twitter because Black Twitter is there most readily. That's where people are going to commune, and that's sort of like the central site for that Black digital public space.
That concludes tonight's program. Please join me in giving a big thank you to Dr. Apryl Williams.